This briefing is a public-facing event. A recording of the audio and video of the briefing will be made available to the press and the public shortly after it concludes. We invited our minority colleagues to the briefing, but they have declined to participate. As this is not an official committee activity, there is no official record for this event. Any member who wishes to share a relevant statement, article, letter, or other item may do so via the personal office communications method. Members must keep microphones muted unless you are speaking, at which time you will need to turn your video cameras and microphones on. For any member using a telephone and audio only, *6 will work to unmute and remute your phones. If anyone is experiencing any trouble connecting during the briefing, please contact the committee's IT Director, Sheila Havener, or its Chief Clerk, Tylis Ali, by email or phone. Their email addresses and phone numbers were sent out with the notice for the briefing. I will now ask the clerk to conduct a roll call to get a sense of who is on the call. Members, please unmute yourself when you respond to the roll call. So will the clerk please call the roll? Thank you.
Chairman Scott,
Present.
Mrs. Davis,
Present.
Mr. Grijalva, Mr. Courtney, Ms. Fudge, Mr. Sablan,
Here.
Ms. Wilson, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. Takano,
Present.
Ms. Adams,
Present.
Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. Norcross,
Present.
Ms. Jayapal, Mr. Morelli, Ms. Wild, Mr. Harder, Mrs. McBath, Ms. Schreier,
Present.
Underwood, Mrs. Hayes, Ms. Shalala, Mr. Levin,
Present.
Ms. Omar, Mr. Trone, Ms. Stevens, Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Trahan, Mr. Castro, Mrs. Fox, Mr. Rowe, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Wahlberg, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Byrne, Mr. Grothman, Ms. Stefanik, Mr. Allen, Mr. Smucker, Mr. Banks, Mr. Walker, Mr. Comer, Mr. Klein, Mr. Fulcher, Mr. Watkins, Mr. Wright, Mr. Muser, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Keller, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Sablan, this concludes the roll call.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And in a moment, we will hear from our distinguished experts. After our experts finish their presentations, I will open the floor for members to ask questions. Members will be recognized in the order in which they seek recognition, not by seniority, so please indicate if you have any question in the chat box. For those using a telephone with audio only, please have your staff indicate your interest in the chat box on your behalf. Today's briefing is 1 hour in length, so members should ask their questions succinctly and be considerate of other members waiting to ask questions. A chime will sound as a reminder to members that their time has expired. I now recognize myself for opening remarks. In recent weeks, we have heard many calls to immediately reopen the more than 124,000 schools that have closed due to COVID-19 pandemic. However, the question we face is not whether we need to reopen our schools. We can all agree that we must reopen schools as soon as possible. The question is how we can ensure that all students, teachers, and families return to schools that are safe and well equipped to provide a quality education. Unfortunately, this won't just be a matter of cleaning and sanitizing campuses. Years of neglect and our reliance on property taxes to fund public schools have forced underserved school communities to endure hazardous and outdated school facilities for decades. As early as 1995, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO as we more often quote, found that half of all schools had indoor air quality issues and 15,000 schools were circulating air unfit to breathe. Even in 2013, schools in the Northern Marianas suffered from inadequate ventilation and weatherproofing, requiring $10.5 million in repairs as documented by the Army Corps of Engineers in its insular schools assessment of buildings and classrooms. Our school infrastructure was set back even further in 2018 by back-to-back typhoons, Mangkhut and Yutu, the second strongest storm in U.S. history. This historic typhoon destroyed campuses and forced students to attend half-day sessions in other schools or in FEMA-built tents, leading to learning loss and trauma. Unfortunately, a new GAO report assessing our nation's public school facilities, which was released this month, confirmed that not much has improved. Today, nationwide, 4 in 10 school districts still need to update or replace their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system or HVAC systems in at least half of their schools. Additionally, more than half of school districts need to replace multiple building systems, including roofing, lighting, plumbing, and safety systems like alarms. According to the Department of Education, repairing all public schools into good conditions would cost $197 billion. The COVID-19 pandemic is only exacerbating these challenges. School districts that went into this crisis needing significant repairs are facing or will face budget shortfalls and devastating cuts to public education. In the Marianas public school system, which serves around 10,000 students, over 700 teachers and school staff were furloughed in April due to budget shortfalls. While CARES funding provided them relief in the near term, the pandemic impact to funding education and safely reopening schools for the 2020-21 school year and beyond is unknown. That's why House Democrats recently introduced H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which includes the committee's Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act. This infrastructure package would invest $100 billion to address hazardous facilities at high-poverty schools over the next 5 years. In short, this legislation gives us the opportunity to not only reopen our schools safely, but prepare them for the future. So today we're joined by Jacqueline, I'm going to try this, Nuiki, and Randy Weigarten to help us understand the state of public school infrastructure and why we must pass both the Moving Forward Act and the Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act. Jacqueline Nuiki, did I get that right, Ms.? Thank you. Is a director in the GAO's Education Workforce and Income Security team. Her current portfolio covers a wide range of pre-K to 12 education issues, including special education, educational outcomes, success, access and discipline for low-income and minority children, school safety, school facility conditions, and school choice, a favorite for all of us in this committee. Randy Weigarten is president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers, the AFL-CIO. As president, Ms. Weingarten has overseen the development of AFT's Quality Education Agenda, which advocates for reforms grounded in evidence, equity, scalability, and sustainability. I want to thank both of you for joining us and for your time today. I now want to turn it over to Ms. Nuiki and Ms. Weigarten to share a few words. Afterwards, we'll take questions from members. So, Ms. Nuiki, please, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Sablan, Chairman Scott, and members of the committee. It's a great pleasure to be here today to discuss the condition of public school facilities. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. As you may know, even before the coronavirus pandemic, there have been instances where a number of schools across the country have had to temporarily close due to hazardous conditions that posed potential health and safety risks to students, teachers, and staff. For example, water damage caused by a leaking roof or HVAC system can lead to problems with indoor air quality and exposure to substances such as mold or asbestos. Drawing on our body of work on school facilities conditions, my remarks today focus on some key findings about health and safety conditions in school facilities, what we know about the relationship between school facilities and students' educational experiences, and observations on how school districts pay for facilities construction and renovation. Regarding health and safety considerations in school facilities, based on our nationally representative survey of school districts, we estimate that about 65% of districts had conducted a facilities assessment at least once in the last 10 years. Virtually all of them did so to evaluate health and safety hazards and to support capital planning. We estimate that about half of school districts nationwide need to update or replace multiple school building systems like HVAC, roofing, or plumbing. That translates to about 36,000 schools in need of HVAC updates. When not operating properly, we know that HVAC can affect indoor air quality and lead to exposure to mold or asbestos. We also personally observed HVAC issues during many of our visits to 55 schools across 6 states. For example, in Michigan, one school we visited uses an original boiler from the 1920s to heat the building. Officials in that district said an engineer is on site to monitor the pressure whenever the boiler is operating and make sure it does not explode. That's a big difference compared to some newer schools we visited, where facility staff monitor systems electronically and adjust them remotely as needed. In Maryland, in a district we visited, officials said they retrofitted some schools with air conditioning, but did not update pipes and insulation serving those HVAC systems, which caused moisture and condensation problems in those buildings. District officials there were worried that this could lead to air quality and mold problems, but said remedying these issues could cost over $1 million for each building. We also know that safe drinking water is another challenge schools face. Though the CDC recommends flushing water systems after prolonged shutdown to reduce risks from lead, mold, and Legionella, our 2018 work on lead in school drinking water showed that an estimated 69% of school districts do not have flushing programs in place. Regarding how school facilities conditions may affect students' educational experiences, most of the research we reviewed on this topic made the broad connection that healthier modern school environments supports children's learning. In our school district survey, school districts' top 3 priorities when updating or renovating schools' facilities seem to be in line with this thinking. Those priorities were improving security, expanding student access to technology, and addressing health hazards. We heard the same story as we visited around the country. In one district, officials told us they used funding from a $1 billion bond for school facilities to address health and safety concerns, HVAC, and roofing, but also allocated some of that funding to increase natural light, upgrade technology to support engineering and robotics programs, and created open and collaborative spaces. A couple of school officials also told us how newly renovated schools had a positive effect on their students. At one elementary school, the principal told us that he noted improvements in attendance, parent engagement, and student academic performance since the renovations. Regarding how school districts pay for renovations and construction, we found that an estimated 90% of districts primarily rely on local or state funding, with the majority of those generally relying on local sources. Perhaps not surprisingly, we found significant differences between high poverty and low poverty districts in both the funding sources used and the total funds available for school facilities. High poverty districts more commonly relied on state funding and less commonly relied on property taxes than low poverty districts. And when we analyzed federal data on school district expenditures for construction, 2 things stood out. First, on average, high poverty districts spend about $300 less per student compared to low poverty districts. And second, while about 1.5 million more students attended school in high poverty districts, those high poverty districts spent about $1 billion less on capital construction than low poverty districts. We also know from past work for this committee that 80% of students attending a high poverty school are Black or Hispanic, and that these students already face myriad challenges in our public schools, from less access to high quality coursework to disproportionate discipline. In closing, public school facilities play an integral role in our society for the 50 million school children and 6 million teachers who learn and work in them daily, and for the tens of million community members who rely on public schools as community centers, voting places, and emergency shelters. And though our work on school facilities condition was completed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and the many challenges it poses, we know that hazardous conditions in school buildings were fairly widespread in 2019 and potentially pose health and safety risks to children and adults alike. We know that wealthier districts are better positioned than poorer districts to pay for renovation and repairs. As such, it will be important to consider these conditions as schools seek to open safely and securely. This completes my prepared remarks, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Nowicki. Ms. Weingarten, did I get that right? I think your microphone is muted.
How about,
yeah.
is it better? Did I get it?
There it is. There it is. Thank you.
And I would actually thank the committee because I have never used Microsoft Teams before. And as I signed in and it said you had to go and do like 5 other things, I immediately had like high blood pressure because I didn't know if I could do it. So you taught me something today and I really, really appreciate it. But, you know, in some ways, that experience that I just went through today in trying to figure out Microsoft Teams is what so many of us and so many of my members have been doing since the middle of March. And in terms of trying to figure out in this COVID moment how to move from in school to remote, within, God bless you, by the way, within 2 or 3 weeks. And, so you're seeing so much anxiety and stress over the conversion to remote, over whether or not it works, over what happens in terms of the lack of having connectivity, and then all of the things now in terms of all the other crises that we're facing. So what I'm going to try to do in the next 3 minutes is kind of marry 2 really important things together, which is how do you reopen schools safely in the aftermath or while we're still in the middle of a COVID crisis, which we know is really, really, really important in order to deal with the well-being of our kids, in order to deal with learning loss, in order to deal with social emotional issues, in order to deal with all the issues that have come up through because of the murder of George Floyd and all of the systemic racism issues, in order to deal with the reopening of the economy issues. So for lots of different reasons, many of us want to, if it's safe to do so, reopen schools in August or the fall, provided we do it safely and provided we do it with respect to all the public health tools that we need to do. That's one whole issue. And the second issue, which is the one that Mr. Nowicki was talking about and which is so important with the bill that Chairman Scott introduced, is what do we do given that there were so many places already that had real infrastructure needs, particularly HVAC needs, which will be particularly important. HVAC needs, lead issues in water, that if one understands the nature of COVID, those systems need to really work well in order to assure that we don't create even more respiratory illness as a result of COVID. So the bottom line is we got a real mess on our hands because of the lack of investment that we know if you were able to do what the Democrats in the House of Representatives wanted to do in one of the first bills you put in at the beginning of 2019, and we would have had some of the work to rebuild America's schools already, we'd be in a lot better shape than we are right now. So Mr. Nowicki already kind of talked about much of what I was going to talk about with respect to the HVAC systems, the boiler systems, all the things that justify the need of having the Reopen and Rebuild America's School Act. And I want to just take my last 2 minutes to basically say this. We think that there is a way of reopening schools safely to deal with the learning, to deal with getting kids back in school in August and September. But it will cost money, and it requires that the public health tools of physical distancing, of cleaning a school, of kids washing their hands, and of having some level of PPE, whether that's masks or whether that's face shields or something else. If we know that those things will be operational in a school, then we believe that we can actually reopen schools. We believe that on top of the HEROES Act, that's going to cost $116 billion for the public health tools, as well as the education tools that I know Representative Hayes knows so well, and the other types of things. But if we don't get the money from the Senate through the HEROES Act, and if we don't get this other funding, it's not going to happen. And so I can go through all of that. I know my time has now elapsed, but we can go through what we need and what we think the kind of prioritization is. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Nyworth, thank you to Ms. Milwaukee. We'll now have member questions for 5 minutes. I'm going to ask my questions, and then just so members can be prepared, Ms. Bonamici, Ms. Adams, Mr. Trahan, Mr. Takano, Chairman Scott, and Mr. Levine in that order. Just remember to, unmute yourself, give it 3 to 5 seconds, and then start speaking. So, Ms. Milwaukee, according to your report, in the 2015-2016 school year, high poverty school districts spend about $719 a student, as compared to the $1,016 spent by low poverty districts. Would you share with us what disparities you were able to observe in the field?
Sure. So, I think it was generally true, though not 100% universal, that we, not surprisingly, saw better conditions in schools generally in wealthier school districts. The boiler that I referenced in my statement was in a Michigan school district, if I'm recalling correctly, that was facing some pretty significant financial challenges. They had issues raising bond revenue. There were districts that were using surplus monies that were due to staffing shortages. So in other words, they were unable to hire enough teachers, and so they were using that money to pay for facilities. It was really notable, I would say, when we were in the schools around the districts, the disparities that we saw, and you can see some of them in the photographs in the report as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I just talking about this, and I was reading the report. I was just recalled, I think it was like last term, when we had witnesses come up, and we had a conversation on Indian country schools. I mean, it was just so painful to hear this. The schools are so dilapidated, and schools in very cold areas during winters actually had no heaters. It's just so painful. So let me turn to Ms. Weingarten. The GAO report found that there are severe needs for mechanical upgrades and replacements, but it also found in the other major systems, plumbing, electrical, roofing, that nearly 1/4 of districts had half or more of the schools in need of the system or component being upgraded or replaced. How does this affect teaching and learning in schools? And what specifically do you hear from your members on the impact of facilities on their teaching?
So I hear 3 things. Number one, basically it exacerbates any kind of health conditions that kids and teachers have. So if you already have a respiratory illness, or you're susceptible to a respiratory illness, the moment that it rains, and you create mold in a school, you're going to exacerbate asthma, or you're going to exacerbate any other kind of respiratory illness. And that's even before we get to lead in the water. We don't have to get to what happened in Flint to understand the issues about lead in the water. So, so you already have an immediate health concern every time that happens. If the window's no longer, you also have economic concerns. So like a school like Yonkers, when the buildings have settled in such a way that the windows no longer close appropriately. So it's not just the boiler, it's also what the heating system is. In Baltimore, you got a situation where, it's cold in the winter because the heating system is not working. They had to close schools several days because you didn't have enough heat, and it's stifling hot in the summer. So it's the reverse of what it's supposed to be. So all of these things hurt people's well-being. They exacerbate health issues. They, make it, more, they, and on and on and on with all those costs. But the other piece is this. When you're walking to a school that's dilapidated, what message does it send to a parent, to a child, or to a teacher? It sends the message that you don't matter and you don't count. That the richest country in the world can't figure out how to spend the money on making education important. And then the third issue is that there's all sorts of learning conditions that, are hurt by this. In a digital age, when you don't have, I'll never forget in the McDowell County schools when we first started there, and you see this in the GAO report as well. If you don't have Wi-Fi and connectivity in every single room, if like in the McDowell schools, if you were going to put the security system on, it would actually mean you had to disband the Wi-Fi system. And so what it says is that, even though we know that all of that is so important, it's not important here. So it's healthcare, it's learning conditions, but it's also a signal that someone is not important.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Weingarten. And as I mentioned earlier, Ms. Bonamici, Ms. Adams, and Ms. Trahan are in the queue right now. So, Ms. Bonamici, you have 5 minutes, please. I think your microphone is. I can't. I still can't. You're muted, Ms. Bonamici. So, Bannon, could we help Susan and come back to her? You will be on top of the queue, Ms. Bonamici.
I think she's good now. Well, she was good.
Okay. Yeah, Ms. Bonamici.
But she went back to mute.
Yeah, I know. I can't.
No, we can hear you, Congresswoman. If you hover over the bottom bar and click unmute.
All right, we're going to go to Ms. Adams and then come back to Ms. Bonamici anytime that she's her microphone is unmuted.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Adams, please.
Yes, can you hear me? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening the hearing today. And thank you to the panelists for sharing your expertise. Ms. Nowicki, your report found that over 40% of all districts had 50% or more of their schools needing mechanical system upgrades or replacements. Since COVID-19 is a respiratory disease spread through droplets and aerosols that are airborne, what relevance do you think this finding has to schools' readiness to reopen and operate our public schools safely?
Well, I think, of course, Congresswoman, it is a huge concern. when you have that number of schools that having HVAC systems that need attention, we should all sit up and pay attention to that. I will note that the CDC guidelines, as you surely know, for reopening schools say to ensure ventilation systems operate properly. And they also note that schools may be able to increase air circulation of outdoor air by opening windows and doors if that can be done safely. So I would say that, of course, HVAC systems are critical to promoting proper air circulation in schools, but it's important to note that in our survey, there could have been a number of reasons why districts needed to update and replace their HVAC systems. In other words, we don't know for certain that all of those systems needed to be replaced because of air circulation problems. It could have been, for example, inadequate heating or leaking. There were several photos in the report that you might recall showing those types of issues as well. But clearly, it's a huge issue.
Okay. So, Ms. Nowicki, your team did extensive field visits. What conditions did your team witness in the field that was most troubling as it related to conditions in public schools? And did you find things on the other end that were probably okay?
We did. We found a range, as you might expect, across the school districts that we visited. Generally speaking, the worst conditions were found in lower poverty schools. And the more improved or more recently renovated facilities were in higher income districts, but not exclusively so. For example, there's a picture in the report of a New Mexico school that is a low income school, beautifully renovated, but the state essentially paid for it. There are side-by-side pictures of boilers in the report. Those are.
I've had my hand up since the beginning.
Those boiler pictures are essentially in the same school, but they could only afford to replace one of them. We noticed disparities even within districts, particularly districts that had a mix of older buildings and newer buildings. We saw buckets in a principal's office where where it reportedly rained in her office daily. We saw leaking roofs, libraries with books that were beginning to mold. That sort of thing, and we saw beautiful schools that were redone and reimagined with wonderful, open, beautifully lit collaborative spaces that had, Wi-Fi throughout the building and all sorts of STEM and STEAM, kinds of upgrades. It really did run the gamut, as you would suspect.
Right. So would you think just replacing these schools would be the most cost-effective and the better way to do it? I mean, since you have schools you have systems that have schools that are relatively new and they have the upgrades, or what do you think? Is it worth trying to repair them?
I think there are, we didn't specifically go for a cost estimate in that way and look at cost effectiveness of replace versus renovate. But we did hear from the districts and the officials that we talked to, they felt, knowing their own situations best, there were both, I would say, out there. There were districts that felt that replacing was the way to go. There were districts that felt that renovating was the way to go. And again, as you might expect, these school officials at the local level know their facilities best and probably have a better sense of which way to go than I do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
You're still muted, Mr. Sablan.
Mr. Sablan, you're muted.
I'm sorry, Ms. Bonamici, can you test your mic, please?
Can you hear me now?
All right, there, perfect.
Oh, thank you so much.
You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the chair, Chair Sablan and Chair Scott, and to our witnesses. Really appreciate this conversation. I have 25 school districts in the congressional district I'm honored to represent. Tremendous disparity in size and in school building. And here in Oregon, the majority of our funding for K-12 education is state, not local, but that doesn't include construction and building construction. So the communities that can pass bonds build new schools and the others are really struggling. So I wanted to ask Ms. Weingarten, I know you talked about this a bit already, but could you talk a little more about what message does it send to students and to educators when their school buildings are run down? You know, particularly at this time in our country where we are dealing with racial equity and justice issues, our low-income communities, our students of color. What message does it send, and how does it affect learning? And importantly, I'm going to ask both you and Ms. Nowicki, where's a model where it's working well? Is there a school district or a state that has really figured out how to have equitable funding for school buildings? Starting with Ms. Weingarten.
So look, you know, there are lots of places that have done bond acts, and those bond acts actually do very much focus to the extent possible on replace instead of repair, particularly if, you know, given the myriad of issues that one has to do. There's a lot of also, you know, not in my backyard zoning issues that happen, which you are as familiar with as everybody else in every place in the 16,000 districts we have. But what right now, let me just say this, which is part of the reason why this bill is so important right now. You know, the cost of borrowing money is it's next to nothing. So this is a moment that one could actually do bonding authority, and that if one and much of the bonding, much of it when it gets dealt with on a local level gets done based upon need as opposed to anything else. But in places, there are districts across the country that have, you know, built new schools. Like I'll talk about my own district in New York City. When I was the president of the teachers union in the late 80s, early 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s, there was huge overcrowding in the Washington Heights area, which is Upper Manhattan. And, you know, there was a big bonding bill done, and there was many new schools built, and it created, as EPI has suggested, many jobs, which are really important now. They were good union jobs. And what happened was they built schools that dealt with many of the social emotional issues we need. We saw that in the new Sandy Hook that was built a few years ago. We saw that in the new high school in Baltimore that was built a few years ago, where you created places for wraparound services for healthcare, for dentistry, for support systems, guidance rooms, where you had the kind of robotics work that you could have. And so at this moment in time, when you have a huge, the kind of GEO report that was presented, and you have big boiler problems and big HVAC problems and all of that, it would really be good to replace these with new schools that not only have those new, you know, internal systems, but also have the ability, and this is a school term that a lot of school teachers now use, particularly in light of COVID, where you can actually do Maslow before you do Bloom. Because if we need to really meet the needs of individual kids, and we need to deal with project-based instruction. So bottom line, it's terrible. Kids are not stupid. Teachers are not stupid. They know what it means when you're walking to a place where you have a dilapidated roof, where you can't drink water from a water fountain. But given the moment, and Chairman Scott's bill is so important, we can borrow money, we can bond things out, and create jobs and new facilities.
It's an investment in our future. Ms. Nowicki, there is quite a disparity in your report and some of the pictures. And are there a couple examples you could highlight? Because we really need to make the case why this is a good investment in our children and our future.
I mean, again, I think when you look, there was a picture of, you know, a Florida school, I believe it was, that had a dumpster or a bucket, you know, underneath a leaking roof inside, I think it was the library or the cafeteria. I forget which. But when you look, you know, the principal, as I mentioned, you know, she said it rains every day in her office. So when you look at some of these schools and the conditions that they're in, and you compare that to some of these gorgeous, open, renovated, I mean, what I think most of us would hope our children would experience in school. Yes, there was huge disparities there. To your original question, I would say, New Mexico has a pretty interesting model in terms of assessment. They assess every school on the same criteria, and then they rank them, and they start doing projects using state money, starting with the worst and moving up the list. So I don't know that it's a model, but it was certainly something that struck us as being unusual, and we didn't see a lot of that kind of approach to either assessing statewide or ranking and ordering in terms of how you'd prioritize what got done first.
Thank you. And as I yield back, I just want to say that it's not that in the United States of America, we can't afford to invest in our children. It is a matter of priorities and values. And I really, truly thank Mr. Scott and the committee for their leadership. This is so important. I serve on the select committee on the climate crisis. We know that temperatures are warming. Schools need to have HVAC systems that work to keep our students and our educators and all the staff at the schools safe and healthy. So thank you for your leadership, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sablan. I yield back.
All right, thank you, Ms. Bonamici, and particularly, mentioned climate change. I come from the Marianas, where not just the cost of electricity is 40+ cents a kilowatt hour, and so we need the conversion to clean energy. Is very important. Mr. Han has 5 minutes and will be followed by Mr. Takano. Mr. Han, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Ms. Weingarten and Ms. Nowicki for being here with us today. This question is for Ms. Weingarten. It's great to see you. It's been too long, but among the provisions added to the Rebuild America School Act that I particularly appreciate is an amendment by my colleague, Congresswoman Wilson. When the bill was marked up 15 months ago, she added clarifying language to ensure that the funds could be used to improve school security. That was an important improvement. It responded to all too real dangers that our students, our faculty, and staff face these days. And GAO estimated that 92% of school districts prioritize security improvements when undertaking facility renovation projects, although one wonders why the figure isn't 100%. So Ms. Wilson's provision will undoubtedly make a significant difference. However, in speaking with constituents back here in Massachusetts, there is similar concern about another kind of emerging danger that my colleague Ms. Adams brought up, which is the risk of transmission of pathogens like COVID-19. And earlier this month, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education directed that schools have medical isolation rooms to temporarily hold symptomatic students or individuals until transport to a hospital is available. Ms. Weingarten, what is your view of this idea? Do schools need funding from bills like this one to build isolation rooms or take other precautions in order to protect the student body, the faculty, and staff?
So, look, I think that there's a lot. So the short answer is yes, but not isolation rooms in the way, I hate the word because it's not isolation rooms in the way one used to think about that. It is so, just like with the testing protocol that we know, and you all know, we put out in April this plan to, safely reopen schools and communities that's on our website, and we just put out a new plan or an addendum, that basically sized what we thought that would cost. I think that that there's a short answer in terms of COVID, and then there's a longer answer in terms of safety and security, which is, the short answer is we have to marry the public health tools that reduce the transmission of a virus in school in order for parents and teachers and kids to feel confident that they can walk into a school and not get sick.
Yeah.
And so in the short answer, you need to actually have some kind of screening that locks into the kind of testing, tracing, and isolation protocols that a community would have. You need to have physical distancing, but the CDC guidelines and our guidelines are very similar on the science, thank God. You need to have the physical distancing, some kind of PPE. Masks, I think that are necessary for older kids. And if you are religious about PPE for younger kids, if you're religious about physical distancing for younger kids, then masks for younger kids may only be necessary as you're traveling, to the bus or something when in a small, hallway. And then you have to really, really, really clean the school every single day. Those kind of public health tools are absolutely imperative. However, in the longer term, if you actually had like a school nurse suite or a health suite that had, small rooms for, if you had to have not just a waiting room, but a room for a school nurse, if a kid had, something wrong and had to declothe, and you had a small room like that, or you had a suite of rooms, then that could serve as an isolation room. And you could do these kind of things. But I would actually argue that you pretty much in this crisis, just like in any other crisis, really need a school nurse all the time. So longer term, thinking about building buildings with places for wraparound services, particularly health and wellness services. And shorter term, we have to actually have a school nurse and some office that can serve as an isolation room.
I appreciate all of that, and especially your sensitivity around the language. Do you believe that the bill's current language is sufficiently clear on eligible uses to ensure such projects could be funded?
Yes, I do, thank you to Congresswoman Adams for doing that. I think we also need to layer, though, something else on, which is, given we all have to be far more intentional about racism and about how we use language about security and safety. The focus, I think, needs to be, how do we assure, how do we assure a safe environment for all kids so that kids do not feel like they have been, particularly Black and brown kids, that they have been criminalized. So I think that the issues of cameras in schools, other kind of safety utilization is really important, but having these small places, which normally safety folks would say, oh no, you don't want to have these small crevices. These small crevices are absolutely imperative for kids to be able to work together and see each other.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Trahan. And so now we have Mr. Takano. You have 5 minutes, followed by Chairman Scott.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sablan, and I appreciate the subcommittee.
Yeah, Mark, may I just, we only have about 1 hour scheduled with time, so could we bundle your questions with Mr. Scott, if you don't mind? Two chairmen, actually.
Well, that's fine. That's fine.
Please, thank you.
Yeah. I'll go straight to it without any preface. Ms. Nowicki, in the GAO report, it was noted that 5 states required school districts to use a portion of their general education fund for maintenance and operations. The amounts ranged from 3 to 6% of the general fund. First, I want to say, do you know how long these states have been requiring this set aside? And secondly, were school districts able to maintain the set aside? And did you find, so I'll repeat those questions so you just have them, and do you know how long the states have been requiring this set aside? Second, were school districts able to maintain the set aside? And thirdly, did you find that any of these schools in those districts required less maintenance replacement or had newer HVAC systems because of this set aside? And finally, what impact do you believe this set aside will have on the local maintenance of schools if other states implement similar models? And thank you, Mr. Sablan. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Chairman Scott, you want to add on to that or your own?
Yes, let me just ask one question to Ms. Weingarten. Can you tell us the importance of distributing the money pursuant to a formula similar to Title I?
Absolutely. So, I mean,
And I think Mr. Levin had a question too, Mr. Sablan, if he could add his.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, Mr. Levin and Mr. Norcross both. So can we provide responses to Mr. Takano and Mr. Scott as in 3 minutes for both of you?
So let me just quickly say, obviously, the federal role in education is supposed to be moored in civil rights more than anything else. And as a result, it must be, I would argue that it must be done in a way that, that follows legislation like Title I. But I would also argue that we need to be very attentive to the territories like Guam and like Puerto Rico and like the District of Columbia, which sometimes does not get the appropriate allocation either, because of, as amazing as Chair Sablan is, there's not the kind of representation in the Senate as the territories need to have. And so, but ultimately that kind of disbursement, Chair Scott, must be done that way because these are the communities that have less ability to raise monies themselves, and so it needs to have that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nowicki, can you quickly respond to some of Mr. Takano's questions?
Yes, sir. So we didn't ask how long those policies had been in place on our state survey. We asked them if they currently had one. We do know that some of them, such as Rhode Island, are newer. They are working up to, I think, starting small and perhaps building up to a goal of 3%. They told us that they were doing that to maintain their investment in school facilities. So in other words, to limit their deferred maintenance backlog. I think that's the information that I recall off the top of my head. I'd be happy to get back to you if we can dig up more after the roundtable.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Levin and Mr. Norcross, could we bundle your questions, please? We have 4 minutes left on the call, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sablan and Mr. Scott, for doing this. I'll be super quick, although my question is kind of big. I want to tie together the condition of our public schools and our lack of investment over many years with our structural racism and climate change. 45% of all the energy used in the United States is used to heat and cool and light our buildings, not just schools, but all of our buildings. So we have to tackle the problems with our school buildings, even just to save our planet. And then your report, Ms. Nowicki, seems incredible. 80% of high poverty districts are majority Black and Hispanic, I believe you said, and they spend $1 billion less, or I didn't get the exact figure, but your report seems so important. So I would ask both of you to address the urgent need to deal with our school buildings in a way that at long last does justice to our communities of color. And then I'll yield to my brother, Mr. Norcross from New Jersey.
Well, actually, Mr. Levin, I'm going to let Mr. Norcross ask his questions so
yes.
The response could be. Don, Mr. Norcross, are you in? Are you still, is your mic unmuted? Yeah, I did see Mr. Norcross earlier, and he did ask he did let us know he had a question. I'm not sure if he's still on. So
I don't see him
we
anymore.
Get to Mr. Norcross, can we get some response to Mr. Levin's question?
Sure. I would go back to what Ms. Weingarten said about the federal role in education being grounded in civil rights and equitable and equal access to a high quality education for all kids. And I think, given the wide body of work that we have done, much of it for this committee, there's a good case to be made that we do not have that right now. And I think, to your point, yes, those districts are spending $1 billion less on capital construction than low poverty districts. We know who attends high poverty districts. This is not new information, I think, probably to any of us on this call. I do think that the way that we fund public education in this country, the choices that we as a nation have made as to how we fund. 90% of districts are relying on basically property taxes. And it's not hard to see where that gets you. So I agree with what you're saying. And when you layer on, Mr. Sablon knows probably better than anyone on this call what happens when you have schools that are hit by a terrible disaster like the 2018 typhoon, and when you don't harden those schools appropriately, and it happens again and again, in terms of trauma, in terms of economic cost, it's a huge issue facing us. I think if any one of us had the exact answer to that, we'd I don't know, we'd be on a reality TV show somewhere making millions of dollars. But clearly, I think the structural racism and the federal role in education, and when you combine it, with the way that we finance education in this country or pay for education in this country, you can't disentangle those things.
But we could structure our help for schools rebuilding in a way that focuses on those questions of justice. And that's what we intend to do as best we can.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to, and I think this is maybe a response to one of Mr. Takano's question was under flexibility of the RASA Act, which is now the RARA Fund. Please refer to section 70112 of HR 2, specifically paragraph 2 or something like that. I think I'm not sure, Ms. Styles, do we have any more time?
I don't think so, and I think Mr. Norcross.
Yeah, okay, and Mr. Norcross has connectivity issues, and so now will not be able to rejoin us. Chairman Scott, you have anything to add before we sign off?
I'll yield to Ms. Hayes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Ms. Hayes, welcome. Ms. Hayes?
I've been here. I just turned on my camera.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just, no wonder
I appreciate the introduction.
I wasn't interested in the call until now.
This whole conversation has been my life for the last 20 years. I am so excited that we are discussing these things because it is impossible to teach under the conditions that we're hearing described. So I'm excited that my colleagues are taking the time to learn and understand these things and partnering to make sure that we come up with solutions. But I can tell you, with no matter what efforts teachers bring to the table, you cannot teach in an unsafe environment. It's period, no matter what you do. When you have no control over the heating or the cooling or the air quality or all of these things that are just added on top of the things that you do have control over, it's impossible. And I'm glad that we are revisiting this conversation. It could not be more timely. We should have made this investment last year when we originally moved this bill out of committee, or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But right now, I don't want to hear any more of thank you to teachers and how amazing and wonderful they are if we are not committing to investing in the spaces and the resources that they need. I had nothing to say, but you drew it out of me.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't have said it better. I yield back.
All right, thank you. And, I still recall, just like it was yesterday, that, Mr. Chairman, that hearing we had when some individuals were discussing about the conditions of schools in Indian countries. It was just, my heart's broken. And I had this plan to bring the subcommittee to the 3 Pacific territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Marianas, but then COVID-19 hit us, and so it was not possible. So anyway, I want to thank everyone, Ms. Nowicki and Ms. Weingarten for joining us today. I want to thank the members for being here. So let's look at these wonderful members that we're surrounded with and all the passion they bring to the conversation. Chairman Scott, thank you. And staff also, thank you for putting this together and for your patience. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. I gotta get ready for church. So anyway, have a good afternoon, everyone, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Mr. Chairman.